My name is Eleanor Patterson, and at 70 years old, I've learned that the most dangerous thing you can be in this world is an invisible woman. Especially when people think they know your whole story just by looking at you. Picture this, a small, gray-haired woman in sensible shoes, living alone in a modest house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa. No husband, no children, no fancy car in the driveway. To my neighbors, to the people at the grocery store, to anyone who bothered to notice me at all, I was just another lonely old lady whose life had somehow passed her by. They had no idea who I really was. They had no idea what I'd done. They had no idea that the quiet woman they pitied and dismissed had once stood in rooms where history was made. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, or at least at the beginning of the end of my patience with being treated like I was nobody. It was a Tuesday morning in October when Mrs. Henderson from next door knocked on my door. She was carrying a casserole dish and wearing that particular expression that said she was about to do her good deed for the day. "Eleanor, dear," she said in that overly sweet voice people use when they think you're pathetic. "I made too much tuna casserole again. I thought you might like some." Mrs. Henderson had been bringing me extra food for 3 years, ever since her husband died, and she decided we were in the same boat. The boat of sad, forgotten women with nothing better to do than wait for death. "That's very kind of you, Dolores," I said, accepting the dish. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" "Oh, I can't stay long. Bridge club at noon." She peered over my shoulder into my living room. "You know, Eleanor, you really should think about joining us sometime. It's not good for a woman your age to spend so much time alone." A woman your age. As if being 70 meant I was already halfway to the grave, incapable of having a meaningful existence without the constant companionship of other people. "I keep busy," I said mildly. "I'm sure you do, dear. But reading and watching television isn't the same as human interaction. When was the last time you had a real conversation with someone?" I almost laughed. If she only knew about the conversation I'd had just yesterday with Senator Martinez about the Environmental Protection Bill. Or the phone call with Dr. Chen at Stanford about the research grant proposal. Or the email exchange with the UNESCO committee about the literacy program in Guatemala. But I didn't say any of that. I'd learned long ago that people see what they expect to see, and they expected to see a lonely old woman who needed their pity. "You're probably right," I said instead. "I should get out more." "Exactly. You know, my daughter Karen is organizing the community center's fall festival. She could use volunteers. It would be a wonderful way for you to meet people." "I'll think about it." "Promise me you will. It breaks my heart to see you so isolated." After she left, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and thinking about isolation. About how people assume that being alone means being lonely. About how they confuse solitude with sadness. The truth was, I chose to live alone. I chose to keep my past private. I chose to let people think I was just another unremarkable widow because it was easier than explaining who I really was. My house was small but comfortable, filled with books and memories and souvenirs from a life most people couldn't imagine. The living room walls were covered with art I'd collected during my travels, a watercolor from a street artist in Prague, a small sculpture from a market in Morocco, a photograph from the Northern Lights that I'd taken during a research expedition in Alaska when I was 62. But if you didn't know what to look for, they just looked like the kind of generic travel souvenirs any tourist might bring home. In my study, which Mrs. Henderson had never seen, were the real treasures. Shelves lined with first edition books, many of them signed. Awards and certificates in frames. Photographs of me with people whose names would be recognized in any history book. And in the locked drawer of my desk, letters. Dozens of them. From presidents and prime ministers, from Nobel Prize winners, from leaders of movements that changed the world. Including the most recent one, which had arrived just last week. But nobody knew about any of that. To the world of Cedar Falls, I was just Eleanor Patterson, the quiet woman who lived alone and probably hadn't done anything interesting in her entire life. The irony was exquisite, really. I'd spent 45 years working behind the scenes, deliberately staying out of the spotlight, making sure other people got the credit for successes I'd helped engineer. I'd been the woman in the background, the trusted advisor, the one who made things happen without needing to be seen doing it. And now, in my retirement, I was invisible for entirely different reasons. Not because I chose to be, but because people my age, especially women my age, simply didn't register as important anymore. I moved to Cedar Falls 5 years ago after retiring from my position at the State Department. I thought it would be peaceful, anonymous, a place where I could finally rest after decades of high-stakes diplomacy and international crisis management. What I hadn't anticipated was how completely I would disappear. In Washington, even in retirement, I was still Dr. Eleanor Patterson, former Under-Secretary of State for Global Affairs, recipient of the Secretary's Distinguished Service Award, architect of 3 major international treaties. People sought my opinions, valued my experience, treated me with respect. In Cedar Falls, I was just the old lady in house number 47 who kept to herself and probably needed more social interaction. The transformation had been gradual. First, people would ask about my background, and I'd give vague answers about working for the government. When they pressed for details, I'd deflect. Oh, just administrative work, nothing very exciting. It was partly self-protection. In small towns, being different can make you a target for gossip, speculation, unwanted attention. And it was partly exhaustion. After decades of being on all the time, of every word being analyzed and every action having consequences, there was something appealing about being nobody special. But lately, the invisibility had started to chafe. It started with small things. The way the grocery store clerk looked right through me, as if I was just another invisible old person. The way the bank teller spoke to me like I was slightly senile, explaining basic concepts I understood better than she did. The way neighbors talked about me when they thought I couldn't hear. Poor Eleanor, I'd overheard Mrs. Henderson telling Mrs. Kowalski over the fence. She just sits in that house all day. I don't think she has any family at all. It's so sad. Maybe we should invite her to book club, Mrs. Kowalski had replied. Give her something to do. Something to do. As if my life was empty, purposeless, a void that needed to be filled with their charity. The worst part was how they talked about my solitude like it was a failure. Like the fact that I'd never married, never had children, somehow made me less of a person. Like my worth was measured entirely by my relationships to other people rather than by what I'd accomplished in my own right. She must be so lonely, they'd whisper. No husband, no children. What a waste. A waste. 45 years of public service, of making decisions that affected millions of lives, of preventing wars and negotiating peace agreements and building bridges between nations that had been enemies for generations. But because I'd chosen my career over traditional family life, my existence was a waste. I've been thinking about all of this more and more lately, especially since receiving the letter. The letter that would change everything, if I chose to let it. But first, I had to endure the fall festival. Mrs. Henderson had been persistent about the volunteer opportunity, and eventually, I'd agreed to help with the bake sale, mostly to stop her worried visits and concerned phone calls. The Cedar Falls Community Center was decorated with orange and brown streamers, hay bales, and artificial pumpkins. The whole thing had a quaint, small-town charm that I might have appreciated more if I hadn't been surrounded by people who treated me like a charity case. I was stationed behind a table laden with homemade cookies, pies, and brownies, wearing a name tag that said Eleanor, volunteer in cheerful orange letters. Next to me was Janet Morrison, a woman in her 50s who ran the local real estate office and seemed to think volume was a substitute for personality. "Isn't this wonderful?" Janet said loudly, surveying the crowd. "The whole community coming together. This is what small-town America is all about." I nodded politely and continued arranging the baked goods. "You know, Eleanor, I'm so glad you decided to participate. Dolores was worried about you spending so much time alone. We all were." "That's very kind," I said. "It's not kind, it's just natural. We look out for each other here. Especially our senior citizens who don't have family support." There it was again. The assumption that being alone meant being abandoned, that not having traditional family structures meant being bereft and pitiable. "I manage just fine," I said mildly. "Oh, I'm sure you do your best. But it can't be easy, living on a fixed income, no children to help out. Have you thought about assisted living? There's a lovely facility just outside town." I was 65 when I retired with a pension that was probably larger than Janet's annual income, plus investments and savings accumulated over 4 decades of well-compensated government service. I was in excellent health, sharper mentally than most people half my age, and perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. But Janet saw a small, gray-haired woman and made assumptions. "I'm quite comfortable where I am," I said. "Well, if you ever need anything, you just let us know. We take care of our own here." The day wore on with more of the same. Well-meaning people treating me like a fragile, helpless creature who needed their protection and guidance. Conversations that stopped when I approached, as if they'd been discussing how to handle the sad old lady. Offers to help me carry things that weren't heavy, to explain things I understood perfectly well, to include me in activities I had no interest in joining. By mid-afternoon, I was ready to go home. But then Karen Henderson, Dolores's daughter, approached my table with 2 other women I recognized from around town. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm so glad you could volunteer today. Mom told me you'd be perfect for this." Karen was in her early 40s, blonde and energetic in the way that suggested she'd been popular in high school and had never quite gotten over it. She introduced her companions as Lisa Chen, no relation to the Dr. Chen I knew from Stanford, and Maria Santos. "We were just talking about how nice it is to have some of our more experienced residents participating," Karen said with a bright smile. "It's so important for seniors to stay engaged." Seniors. Experienced residents. The euphemisms people use when they meant old and therefore irrelevant. "We were thinking," Lisa said, "that maybe you'd be interested in joining our women's group. We meet every Thursday evening. We do crafts, share recipes, sometimes watch movies. It's perfect for women who have a lot of time on their hands," Maria added. "Very relaxing. Very social. Women who have a lot of time on their hands." The assumption that retirement meant sitting around with nothing meaningful to do. "That sounds lovely," I said, maintaining my polite smile. "But I'm afraid I'm quite busy most evenings." "Oh?" Karen looked puzzled. "Busy with what?" It was an innocent question, but it carried the weight of their assumptions. What could a 70-year-old woman possibly be busy with? What could I possibly be doing that was more important than their craft circle? "Various projects," I said vaguely. "What kind of projects?" Lisa pressed, her tone suggesting she couldn't imagine what those might be. I could have told them about the book I was writing about diplomatic negotiations in post-Cold War Eastern Europe. I could have mentioned the consulting work I was doing for the UN on refugee policy. I could have explained that I was serving on the advisory board for an international women's education initiative. Instead, I said, "Oh, this and that. Reading mostly." "Reading," Maria said, as if I'd confessed to collecting stamps. "That's nice. What do you read? Romance novels?" "History, mostly. Biography. International affairs." They exchanged glances, the kind that said they thought I was trying to sound more intellectual than I actually was. "Well," Karen said with forced enthusiasm, That's great that you're keeping your mind active. But you know, there's more to life than books. Human connection is so important, especially as we get older." As we get older. I wasn't we. I was I. An individual with my own thoughts, experiences, accomplishments, and preferences. But to them, I was just a representative of a demographic category, elderly woman, alone, probably declining, definitely in need of their help and guidance. "You're absolutely right," I said. "Human connection is very important." "Exactly. So you'll think about the women's group?" "I'll definitely think about it." They moved on, satisfied that they'd done their good deed for the day. I continued selling cookies and brownies, smiling politely at customers who either ignored me completely or spoke to me in the kind of slow, loud voice people use with children and the mentally impaired. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself listening to conversations around me. Conversations about people I knew or thought I knew. "Did you see that new family that moved into the Morrison place?" One woman was saying. "The husband works for some tech company. They have a Tesla." "Really? Must be doing well for themselves." "Oh yes, very successful." The wife was telling me they just got back from a vacation in Europe. "They're very worldly." "Worldly?" Successful. These were the words that earned respect and admiration. Not wisdom, not experience, not decades of service. Money and status symbols and the ability to travel for pleasure. I thought about my own travels, to conflict zones and refugee camps, to peace negotiations and diplomatic summits. I'd been to more countries than most people could name, but because I'd gone as a public servant rather than a tourist, because I'd stayed in government housing rather than luxury hotels, because my purpose had been work rather than leisure, somehow that didn't count as being worldly. Later, as I was packing up unsold baked goods, I overheard Karen talking to her friends near the coffee station. I really think we need to do more outreach to our isolated seniors, she was saying. Take Mrs. Patterson, for example. Sweet lady, but she's clearly struggling with loneliness. No family, limited income, probably hasn't had a meaningful conversation in months. It's so sad, Lisa replied. You can tell she's trying to put on a brave face, but you know she must be desperately lonely. And a little defensive about it, Maria added. Did you notice how she claimed to be busy with projects? Poor thing probably doesn't want to admit she has nothing to do. We should make a special effort to include her, Karen said. Maybe invite her to things individually rather than waiting for her to join groups. She might be too shy or embarrassed to put herself out there. Too shy. Too embarrassed. Desperately lonely. Struggling. Limited income. Probably doesn't want to admit she has nothing to do. I stood there, invisible behind my table of leftover brownies, listening to these women dissect my life and personality based on nothing more than my age, my gender, and my living situation. They constructed an entire narrative about who I was and what I needed, and nothing I'd said or done had penetrated their preconceptions. That's when I made my decision. I was tired of being invisible. Tired of being dismissed. Tired of being treated like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. It was time for Cedar Falls to learn who Eleanor Patterson really was. But first, I had one more week of being nobody special. One more week of letting them think they knew my story. Because the letter in my desk drawer was going to change everything. Chapter 2, The Weight of Secrets and the Cost of Anonymity. The week after the fall festival, the attention from my new concerned neighbors intensified. It was as if Karen Henderson had appointed herself my personal social worker, determined to drag me kicking and screaming into their version of a fulfilling senior citizen's life. Monday morning brought another casserole from Mrs. Henderson, this time with a side of maternal concern. Eleanor, dear, Karen told me about your conversation at the festival. She's worried about you. I was watering my tomato plants, October in Iowa, but I'd built a small greenhouse in my backyard where I could grow things year-round. Another project that none of them knew about. Worried about what? Well, you know. The isolation. She said you seemed defensive when she tried to be friendly. Defensive. The word women get labeled with when we refuse to accept other people's definitions of what we need. I wasn't defensive, Dolores. I was polite. Of course you were, dear. But sometimes when we've been alone too long, we can misinterpret kindness as intrusion. When we've been alone too long. As if solitude was a disease that gradually eroded your ability to function in society. Karen is just trying to help, she continued. We all are. It's not healthy for someone your age to be so isolated. I'm not isolated, Dolores. I choose to be selective about my social activities. She gave me that look, the one that said she thought I was making excuses for my inability to connect with people. Well, regardless, she's invited you to Thursday night women's group. I really think you should go. I told her I'd think about it. Eleanor, what could you possibly have to do that's more important than making friends? The question hung in the air between us. What could I possibly have to do? What could a 70-year-old woman's time be filled with that would take precedence over their social activities? I thought about my morning. I'd started the day with a video conference call to Geneva, where I was consulting on a refugee resettlement program. Then I'd spent 2 hours working on my book manuscript, followed by correspondence with 3 different universities about guest lecture opportunities. After lunch, I was planning to review a policy paper for the Brookings Institution. But how do you explain that to someone who sees you as a charity case? You're right, I said finally. I should probably make more of an effort. That seemed to satisfy her. She patted my arm in a way that was probably meant to be comforting but felt condescending. That's the spirit. You'll see, once you start getting out more, you'll feel so much better about everything. After she left, I went inside and made myself a cup of tea, thinking about the assumptions people make about happiness. The idea that solitude equals sadness, that independence equals loneliness, that a life without traditional markers of success, marriage, children, social clubs, must somehow be unfulfilling. I'd been genuinely happy for most of my adult life. Happy in my work, happy in my achievements, happy in my ability to make a difference in the world. I had friends, real friends, not just social acquaintances, scattered across the globe. People who knew my mind, respected my opinions, valued my contributions. But those friendships were invisible to the people of Cedar Falls because they existed in phone calls and emails, in professional conferences and international summits, in a world that might as well be another planet as far as my neighbors were concerned. Tuesday brought a visit from Janet Morrison, who knocked on my door with a folder full of brochures. "Eleanor, I hope you don't mind me stopping by, but I've been thinking about our conversation at the festival." She invited herself in, settling onto my couch and spreading the brochures across my coffee table like a real estate agent making a pitch. "I've been doing some research on senior living options in the area. Now, I know you said you're comfortable here, but I really think you should consider your long-term needs." The brochure showed smiling elderly people playing bingo, doing water aerobics, sitting in circles having what the captions described as meaningful conversations with peers. "This one is particularly nice," Janet said, pointing to a glossy photo of a dining room. 3 meals a day, housekeeping service, organized activities. And the best part is, you'd be surrounded by people your own age. No more eating dinner alone. Eating dinner alone. She said it like it was a tragic circumstance rather than a choice. I happened to enjoy my solitary dinners, reading while I ate, listening to classical music, thinking through complex problems without interruption. "It looks very nice," I said politely. "And practical too. Let's face it, Eleanor, at our age, things can change quickly. What if you fell and couldn't get help? What if you had a medical emergency? Here, you'd have staff available 24 hours a day." At our age. Janet was probably 15 years younger than me, but apparently anyone over 50 was lumped into the same category of declining capability. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm in good health." "Of course you are now. But we have to plan ahead. And frankly, the social benefits alone would be worth it. Imagine having friends right down the hall, always someone to talk to. Always someone to talk to. The ultimate nightmare for someone who'd spent her career in situations where every word mattered, every conversation had consequences, every moment of privacy was precious." "I'll definitely consider it," I lied. "Wonderful. I can arrange tours whenever you're ready. No pressure, of course." No pressure, except for the clear implication that staying in my own home was foolish, dangerous, and selfish to the community members who felt obligated to worry about me. Wednesday brought the most telling encounter yet. I was at the grocery store, reaching for a jar of olive tapenade on a high shelf, when Karen Henderson appeared beside me. "Oh, Mrs. Patterson. Let me get that for you." She reached up easily and handed me the jar, smiling like she'd rescued me from a dangerous situation. "Thank you." "No problem at all. You know, you really should ask the staff for help with things like that. We don't want you getting hurt trying to reach." I was 5 feet 6 inches tall and in excellent physical condition. The jar was on a shelf maybe 6.5 feet high. I could have reached it easily, but apparently my age made me automatically incapable in her eyes. "Olive tapenade," she said, reading the label. "That's very sophisticated. Do you cook much?" "Some. I love to cook, but it's so hard to motivate myself to make elaborate meals when it's just for one person. Don't you find that?" There was the assumption again, that living alone meant settling for less, making do, gradually diminishing your standards and expectations. "I enjoy cooking," I said. "I find it relaxing." "That's wonderful that you're keeping up with it. A lot of seniors just give up and start eating frozen dinners. It's so sad." A lot of seniors. I wasn't a lot of seniors. I was Eleanor Patterson, and I've been cooking sophisticated meals for myself since I was 25 years old and living in my first apartment in Washington, D.C. Well, I should let you finish your shopping, Karen said. But remember, Thursday night, women's group. 7 o'clock at the community center. We're making fall centerpieces. I remember. Great. And Eleanor? Don't worry about bringing anything. We know money can be tight on a fixed income. Money can be tight on a fixed income. The assumption that retirement meant poverty, that my small house and modest car indicated financial struggle rather than deliberate choices about how to live. After she walked away, I stood in the International Foods aisle holding my olive tapenade and thinking about the stories people tell themselves about other people's lives. How they see the surface and assume they understand the depths. How they project their own fears about aging onto anyone who doesn't fit their template for successful senior living. That evening, I sat in my study looking at the letter on my desk. The letter that had arrived the previous week with the presidential seal, addressed to Dr. Eleanor Patterson in formal script. I'd read it so many times I had it memorized, but I picked it up again, feeling the weight of the heavy paper, seeing the official letterhead. Dear Dr. Patterson, it is my honor to inform you that you have been selected to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, our nation's highest civilian honor, in recognition of your exceptional contributions to international diplomacy and your tireless efforts to promote peace and understanding between nations. Your work in negotiating the Baltic Peace Accords, your leadership in establishing the International Women's Education Initiative, and your 4 decades of distinguished service in advancing American interests abroad have made an indelible mark on history. The ceremony will be held at the White House on November 15, and I personally look forward to thanking you for your service to our country and to the cause of global peace. With deepest respect and admiration. Signed, President of the United States. The Presidential Medal of Freedom. The highest honor a civilian could receive. For work that the people of Cedar Falls couldn't even imagine I'd done. I thought about Karen Henderson making fall centerpieces and assuming I couldn't afford to contribute supplies. About Janet Morrison trying to convince me to move to assisted living because she thought I was a lonely old woman with no support system. About Mrs. Henderson bringing me casseroles because she was worried about my limited income. None of them had any idea that the woman they pitied had spent 45 years in rooms where the most powerful people in the world sought her counsel. That I'd prevented wars, negotiated treaties, shaped policies that affected millions of lives. But that was about to change. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized decades ago. White House Social Office, this is Rebecca. Rebecca, this is Eleanor Patterson. I received the invitation to the Medal of Freedom ceremony. Dr. Patterson. Congratulations, we're so honored to have you. Do you have any questions about the ceremony details? Actually, I was wondering about the media coverage. Will there be press present? Oh yes, ma'am. Full press coverage. CNN, all the major networks, plus print media. It's always a significant news event. And the guest list will be public? The recipients are always announced in advance, yes ma'am. Usually about a week before the ceremony. Perfect. Thank you, Rebecca. Is there anything else I can help you with, Dr. Patterson? No, that's everything. I'll see you on the 15th. I hung up and sat back in my chair, thinking about timing. The announcement would come next Tuesday, the day after Karen's women's group meeting, the day after I'd promised to attend their craft circle and let them try to fix my lonely, empty life. I had one more week of being nobody special. One more week of accepting their pity and their condescension and their assumption that my life was small and sad and in need of their charitable intervention. And then everything would change. But first, I was going to make fall centerpieces. Thursday evening arrived gray and cold, with the kind of wind that reminded you winter was coming. I drove my 7-year-old Honda Civic to the community center, parking between a BMW and a Mercedes, carrying a bag with my contribution to the evening's activities. The community center's main room had been set up with folding tables covered in brown paper. Each table had supplies for making autumn decorations, pumpkins, gourds, colorful leaves, ribbon, wire, glue guns that looked like instruments of torture. Karen Henderson was in her element, wearing a sweater with embroidered fall leaves and directing traffic with the authority of someone who'd been running these kinds of events since she was PTA president 20 years ago. "Eleanor, you came." She rushed over to greet me like I'd just arrived from a dangerous journey. "I'm so glad you decided to join us." The other women were already seated at the tables, about 20 women ranging in age from their 40s to their 80s. I recognized most of them from around town, though I'd never had more than brief conversations with any of them. "Ladies, this is Eleanor Patterson," Karen announced to the room. "She lives over on Maple Street. This is her first time joining us, so let's make her feel welcome." A chorus of hellos and welcomes, all delivered with that special tone people use when they're being extra nice to someone they perceive as needy. I was seated at a table with Mrs. Henderson, Janet Morrison, and 3 other women I knew by sight but not by name. Karen bustled around making sure everyone had supplies and explaining the evening's project. "We're making centerpieces for the Thanksgiving dinner at the Senior Center," she announced. "It's such a wonderful way to give back to our community's most vulnerable residents." Most vulnerable residents. I wondered if any of those senior center diners had spent their careers preventing international conflicts or negotiating billion-dollar aid packages. "Eleanor, have you made centerpieces before?" asked one of the women at my table. I thought her name was Betty. "Not recently," I admitted. "Oh, it's so easy. And fun. There's something so therapeutic about working with your hands, don't you think?" Working with your hands. As if I'd spent my life in purely cerebral pursuits and never learned to do anything practical. As we worked on our arrangements, the conversation flowed around me. Gossip about neighbors, discussions of children and grandchildren, complaints about arthritis and blood pressure medications. Normal, human conversation that I might have enjoyed if it hadn't been punctuated by constant references to my perceived situation. "Eleanor, do you have children?" Betty asked as she hot-glued a miniature pumpkin to a basket. "No, I never had children." "Oh." That particular pause that said she didn't know whether to express sympathy or change the subject. "Well, children can be such a blessing, but they can also be a burden. My daughter calls me every day wanting something." "That must be complicated," I said. "Sometimes I envy women like you," she continued. "So free. No obligations. You can do whatever you want. Women like you. Free from obligations. As if not having children meant floating through life without purpose or responsibility." "What about you, Eleanor?" Janet asked. "What did you do before retirement? For work, I mean." Here was the moment I'd been navigating for 5 years. The question that always came up eventually. "I work for the government," I said, my standard response. "Oh, how nice. What department?" "State Department." "In Des Moines?" "Washington, D.C." A little ripple of interest around the table. Washington was at least impressive, even if they couldn't imagine what I might have done there. "How exciting," Karen said. "What kind of work?" "Administrative mostly. Nothing very glamorous." "Still Washington. You must have some interesting stories." I smiled noncommittally and focused on my centerpiece. If I started telling stories about Washington, where would I stop? The time I spent 3 days locked in negotiations with Russian diplomats while the world teetered on the edge of a trade war? The summit in Switzerland where I helped draft the framework for international climate change cooperation? The emergency session at the UN where my analysis prevented a military intervention that could have destabilized an entire region? "Did you ever meet anyone famous?" Betty asked. "A few people here and there." "Like who?" "Oh, you know how it is in government work. Lots of meetings with lots of people whose names you forget." It was easier to deflect than to explain. Easier to let them think I'd been a secretary or a clerk than to describe a career that would sound like fantasy to people who saw me as a lonely old woman making crafts. The evening wore on with more of the same. Kind, well-meaning women who wanted to help me adjust to my sad, isolated existence. Offers to include me in book clubs and volunteer activities and potluck dinners. Suggestions for how to fill my empty days and combat my obvious loneliness. "You should really consider online dating," suggested a woman named Carol. My neighbor met her husband on one of those silver singles websites. Never too late for love. Or get a pet, added Betty. Cats are wonderful companions for women living alone. The important thing is to stay active, Janet said. Keep your mind engaged. Have you thought about taking a class at the community college? Taking a class. Keep your mind engaged. As if retirement meant the beginning of intellectual decline rather than the freedom to pursue projects I was passionate about. What kind of class? I asked. Oh, they have all sorts of things. Basic computer skills, cooking for one, intro to watercolors. Perfect for beginners. Basic computer skills. I'd been using computers since they were room-sized machines that required punch cards. I'd participated in video conferences with world leaders, managed databases containing classified information, written reports that were read in the highest levels of government. But they saw a 70-year-old woman and assumed I needed help sending emails. That sounds interesting, I said. By 9 o'clock, we'd finished our centerpieces. Mine looked decent despite my lack of experience with hot glue guns, and we're cleaning up our workspaces. Thank you so much for coming, Eleanor, Karen said as I gathered my things. I hope you'll join us again next week. We're making holiday cards for the troops. That sounds lovely. And remember, if you ever need anything at all, you just call. We're here for you. We're here for you. The phrase that sounded supportive but carried the underlying message that I needed to be here for, that I was someone who required community assistance to function. I drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, thinking about the evening. These were good people, genuinely kind people who wanted to help someone they perceived as struggling. Their intentions were pure, their motives were generous. But their assumptions were suffocating. Back home, I sat in my study with a cup of tea and looked at the letter on my desk. In 4 days, the White House would announce the Medal of Freedom recipients. In 4 days, the entire world would know who Eleanor Patterson really was. But tonight, I was still just the lonely old lady who needed their help making fall centerpieces. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to my editor at Georgetown University Press. Dear Michael, I've decided to add a new chapter to the book, something about the invisibility of older women in American society, and how that invisibility can be both a burden and, occasionally, a strategic advantage. I think it will resonate with readers. Best. Eleanor. Then I opened another email, this one to my friend Sarah Chen at Stanford. Yes, the Dr. Chen that Janet Morrison's grocery store acquaintance wasn't related to. Sarah. You're going to see my name in the news next week. Don't worry, it's good news. But it might be amusing to you to know that my neighbors have spent the last 5 years trying to get me to join their craft circle because they're worried about my social isolation. Sometimes the best disguise is simply being an older woman. Talk soon. Eleanor. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, thinking about disguises and assumptions and the stories people tell themselves about other people's lives. In 4 days, everything would change. But for now, I was content to let them think they knew who I was. After all, the best revelations are worth waiting for. Chapter 3, The Moment of Truth, When Everything Changes. Tuesday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that makes Iowa look like a postcard. I was drinking my coffee and reading the Washington Post online when my phone started ringing. The first call was from Janet Morrison. Eleanor. Oh my God, Eleanor. Turn on CNN right now. I could hear the television in the background, voices talking urgently about breaking news. What's happening, Janet? They're announcing something about the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Turn it on. I already knew what they were announcing, of course. I'd been expecting this call, had actually been surprised it took until 8:47 a.m. for someone to notice. I'll turn it on, I said calmly. Call me back. This is incredible. The next call came 3 minutes later. Mrs. Henderson, practically hyperventilating. Eleanor. Eleanor, are you watching the news? Yes, Dolores. There's a woman with your name. Eleanor Patterson. She's getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Can you believe it? The same name as you. I almost smiled. That is quite a coincidence. Isn't it amazing? She must be about your age too. The reporter said she's 70 years old and from Iowa. What are the odds? Pretty remarkable, I agreed. Karen is calling everyone. We're all so excited. Imagine, someone from Iowa getting the highest honor in the country. We should have a viewing party for the ceremony. By 10 a.m., my phone had rung 12 times. By noon, there was a small crowd gathered on my front lawn. I watched from my living room window as neighbors clustered together, talking animatedly and pointing at my house. Mrs. Henderson was clearly holding court, probably explaining to anyone who would listen about the incredible coincidence of names. Finally, around 1 p.m., Karen Henderson knocked on my door. She was practically vibrating with excitement. "Eleanor, you'll never believe what's happening." "What's happening, Karen?" "There's another Eleanor Patterson getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And she's from Iowa. And she's 70 years old. Just like you." "That is amazing." "I know, right? Mom thinks we should throw a party to watch the ceremony. You know, to celebrate having the same name as someone so important." Someone so important. The phrase hung in the air between us. "That sounds lovely," I said. We were wondering. "Do you think it's possible you're related? I mean, Patterson isn't that uncommon a name, but still. Eleanor Patterson from Iowa, 70 years old. The resemblance is remarkable." Resemblance. She meant the name, of course, but I wondered what she'd think if she knew she was looking at the actual Eleanor Patterson, the one CNN was calling one of the most influential diplomats of the modern era. "I suppose anything's possible," I said. "Oh my God, what if you are related? What if you're cousins or something? Wouldn't that be incredible?" By evening, the entire story had taken on a life of its own. According to the version I heard from Mrs. Henderson, who'd been fielding calls all day from neighbors and friends, they decided that I was probably a distant relative of the famous Eleanor Patterson and that we should definitely have a watch party for the ceremony. "It's just too much of a coincidence," she explained as she stood in my kitchen, having invited herself in to discuss party planning. "Same name, same age, same state. You must be connected somehow." "It's certainly interesting," I agreed. "I've been thinking about it all day. Maybe you should try to contact her. Maybe she'd want to meet you. Imagine, your own relative getting the highest honor in the country." My own relative. I was beginning to understand how thoroughly they'd convinced themselves that I couldn't possibly be the same person. The idea that the Eleanor Patterson they knew, the quiet, lonely woman who needed their help making crafts, could be the Eleanor Patterson receiving a presidential medal was literally unthinkable. "Have you learned anything else about her?" I asked. "Oh yes. Karen's been researching all day. She worked for the State Department for 45 years. She helped negotiate some major international treaties. She's written books. Can you imagine?" She said it with the tone of someone describing an alien species. As if the idea of someone she knew writing books was beyond the realm of possibility. "She sounds very accomplished. Incredibly accomplished. And get this, she never married, never had children. Devoted her whole life to her career." Devoted her whole life to her career. Said with a mixture of awe and pity, as if such dedication was simultaneously admirable and tragic. How interesting. I feel a little sorry for her, to be honest. I mean, yes, she's achieved incredible things, but she must be so lonely. All that success, but no family to share it with. There it was again. The assumption that professional achievement without traditional family structures equaled loneliness. That success without marriage and children was somehow hollow. Maybe she chose that life, I suggested. "Oh, I'm sure she did. But still, what woman wouldn't want a family? What woman wouldn't want someone to come home to, someone to take care of her in her old age? What woman, indeed?" I thought about my life, the fascinating people I'd met, the complex problems I'd solved, the satisfaction of knowing I'd made a difference in the world. I thought about the freedom to travel anywhere, anytime, to pursue any project that interested me, to structure my days according to my own priorities and passions. "Some women find fulfillment in other ways," I said mildly. "I suppose. But at the end of the day, what matters more than family? What matters more than being loved?" Who said anything about not being loved? I had friendships that had lasted decades, relationships built on mutual respect and shared interests rather than obligation or convenience. I've been loved by people who chose to love me for who I was, not who they needed me to be. But I didn't say any of that. You're probably right, I said instead. Wednesday brought a visit from Janet Morrison, who arrived with a folder full of printed articles about the Medal of Freedom ceremony. I've been reading everything I can find about your namesake, she announced, settling onto my couch. She's really quite remarkable. Tell me what you've learned. Well, she negotiated this thing called the Baltic Peace Accords that prevented a war between three countries. And she helped establish some international education program for women in developing countries. And she's advised 4 different presidents. Janet was reading from her notes, her voice filled with wonderment. She sounds impressive. Impressive? Eleanor, this woman shaped international policy for half a century. She's probably one of the most powerful women you've never heard of. One of the most powerful women you've never heard of. The irony was exquisite. I wonder why she kept such a low profile, I said. That's what's so interesting. According to this article, she deliberately stayed out of the spotlight. She believed in letting the work speak for itself rather than building a personal brand. Janet looked up from her papers, studying my face. You know, Eleanor, the more I read about her, the more I think you two might actually be related. Not just the name and age thing, there's something about her that reminds me of you. What do you mean? Well, she's described as very private, very independent. Brilliant but modest. And look at this photo, she has your same coloring, your same bone structure. She showed me a newspaper photo from the announcement. It was a professional headshot, probably taken for some official State Department publication a few years ago. I looked formal, serious, wearing the kind of conservative suit that said take me seriously in a room full of men. I suppose there is a resemblance, I said. More than a resemblance. Eleanor, I really think you should look into your family history. This could be your aunt, your cousin, maybe even your sister. Your sister. The idea that we might be siblings rather than the same person was so absurd I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. That's an interesting thought. Promise me you'll consider it. At the very least, you should watch the ceremony. We're having the party here in town, community center, big screen, the whole thing. You have to come. I wouldn't miss it, I said truthfully. Thursday brought the most entertaining conversation yet. Karen Henderson arrived with her laptop, having appointed herself the neighborhood's expert on all things Eleanor Patterson. I've been digging deeper into her background, she announced, opening her computer on my kitchen table. And I think I've figured out the connection. Really? Yes. Look at this genealogy website. There are several Patterson families in Iowa going back to the 1800s. I bet if we trace your family tree, we'll find the link. She was serious. Completely, genuinely serious about helping me discover my relationship to myself. That's very thorough of you, Karen. I'm thinking you might be second cousins. Your grandfather and her grandfather could have been brothers. That would explain the physical resemblance and the name connection. Second cousins. She'd worked out an entire family tree to explain how I could be related to me. What else have you learned about her? Oh, so much. Did you know she speaks 6 languages? She has a PhD from Harvard. She's lived all over the world. She owns apartments in 3 different countries. Apartments in 3 different countries was a bit of an exaggeration. I owned my house in Cedar Falls and had a small place in Washington that I kept for when I was consulting. But the rest was accurate. She sounds very cosmopolitan. Incredibly cosmopolitan. And get this, she's never even been married. Can you imagine? 70 years old and never found anyone. Never found anyone. As if the problem was a lack of options rather than a series of deliberate choices about how to structure my life. Maybe she never wanted to get married, I suggested. Oh, she probably did. But you know how it is for career women. Men can be intimidated by successful women. Especially back when she was young, the 70s and 80s were still pretty traditional. Karen had constructed an entire narrative about my romantic history based on her assumptions about what successful women must sacrifice for their careers. Plus, she continued, she was probably traveling all the time, working crazy hours. Hard to maintain a relationship under those circumstances. That's true. It's actually kind of sad. All that success, all those achievements, but no one to share them with. No children to carry on her legacy. No children to carry on her legacy. As if professional accomplishments and contributions to society didn't count as legacy unless they were passed down through biological inheritance. She's certainly made an impact on the world, I said. Oh, absolutely. Don't get me wrong, I admire her tremendously. It's just, I don't know. There's something lonely about a life like that. Something lonely about a life like that. About my life, if she only knew. Friday arrived with news that the community center watch party had grown into a full-scale event. According to Mrs. Henderson, who stopped by with updates every few hours, they were expecting over 100 people. The mayor's coming, she announced breathlessly. And the newspaper wants to do a story about our local connection to the Medal of Freedom winner. Local connection? You. They want to interview you about sharing a name with such a famous person. Isn't that exciting? They wanted to interview me about sharing a name with myself. The situation was rapidly becoming surreal. I'm not sure I'd be very interesting to interview, I said. Are you kidding? You're the only person in town with the same name as a Presidential Medal of Freedom winner. That's definitely newsworthy. I suppose it is. Plus, we're all convinced you must be related somehow. The resemblance is just too strong to be coincidental. The resemblance between me was indeed quite strong. Saturday brought a call from a reporter at the Cedar Falls Gazette. Mrs. Patterson? This is Tom Bradley from the Gazette. I understand you share a name with the Eleanor Patterson who's receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom on Monday. That's correct. I'd love to do a story about that connection. Could we set up an interview? What kind of story? Oh, local interest piece. What it's like to have the same name as someone so accomplished. Whether you think you might be related. That sort of thing. What it's like to have the same name as myself. This was getting better by the minute. I'm not sure I'd have much to say about it. Come on, Mrs. Patterson. Don't be modest. This is a big deal. How often does someone from Cedar Falls share a name with the Presidential Medal winner? Never, as far as I knew. But then again, I was probably the first Presidential Medal winner to live in Cedar Falls under any circumstances. All right, I said. When would you like to meet? How about Sunday afternoon? Before the big watch party on Monday? That works for me. Sunday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. I was beginning to feel like I was living in some kind of elaborate theatrical production where everyone had memorized their lines except me. Tom Bradley turned out to be an earnest young man in his 20s, the kind of small-town reporter who took every assignment seriously, no matter how trivial it might seem to outsiders. He set up a small recording device on my kitchen table and opened his notebook. So, Mrs. Patterson, when did you first hear about the other Eleanor Patterson? The other Eleanor Patterson. I was officially the other one. Tuesday morning, when the announcement was made. And what was your reaction? Surprise, I suppose. It's not every day you hear your name associated with such an honor. Do you think there's a possibility you're related? I suppose it's possible. I haven't researched my family tree extensively. What do you know about your background? Your family history? This was where things got interesting. I could tell him the truth, that my father was a high school principal and my mother was a librarian, that I'd grown up in Cedar Rapids and earned a scholarship to Harvard, that I'd spent my entire adult life in government service. Or I could maintain the fiction that I was just a retired government employee who happened to share a name with someone important. My family has been in Iowa for several generations, I said carefully. My father worked in education, my mother in the library system. And you mentioned you work for the government as well? Yes, State Department. Administrative work mostly. In Washington? Yes. Did you ever cross paths with the other Eleanor Patterson? I mean, if you both work for the State Department. Now that was an interesting question. Did I ever cross paths with myself? It's a large organization, I said. Thousands of employees. I probably never worked in the same building as her. Technically true. I'd worked in many buildings over the years. Still, what are the odds? Two Eleanor Pattersons, both from Iowa, both working for the State Department. It does seem like quite a coincidence. Tom scribbled in his notebook, clearly pleased with this angle. What do you think of her accomplishments? The Baltic Peace Accords, the Women's Education Initiative, all of it? She sounds like a remarkable woman. Do you ever wonder what your life might have been like if you'd pursued a career like hers? High-level diplomacy, international travel, shaping world events? If I'd pursued a career like hers. As if I'd somehow chosen a different path, a lesser path, rather than the exact same path under a different level of public recognition. I think everyone wonders about the roads not taken, I said diplomatically. Any regrets? About staying in administrative roles rather than pursuing something more ambitious? More ambitious. He thought my life had been less ambitious than my life. I've been satisfied with my choices, I said. Well, you should be proud to share a name with such an accomplished woman. Not everyone gets to be associated, even tangentially, with the Presidential Medal of Freedom winner. Associated, tangentially, with myself. It's certainly an honor, I agreed. After Tom left, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the interview, about the story he'd write, about the assumptions embedded in every question he'd asked. The assumption that there were two different Eleanor Pattersons. The assumption that one was remarkable and the other was ordinary. The assumption that sharing a name with someone important was the closest I'd ever come to importance myself. Tomorrow was the ceremony. Tomorrow, the entire charade would come to an end. But first, I had to attend my own viewing party. Chapter 4, The Revelation, where everything finally makes sense. Monday morning dawned bright and cold, with the kind of crystalline light that makes everything look sharp and defined. I woke up knowing that this would be the last day anyone in Cedar Falls thought of me as just the lonely old lady who needed their help and charity. By evening, they'd know exactly who Eleanor Patterson was. I took my time getting dressed, choosing a navy blue suit I'd worn to countless diplomatic functions over the years. It was well-tailored, conservative, the kind of outfit that commanded respect in rooms where decisions affecting millions of people were made. The community center viewing party was scheduled to start at 6 p.m., with the actual ceremony beginning at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. I arrived at 5:45, carrying a covered dish, my grandmother's famous apple crisp, made from scratch with apples from my own backyard trees. The main room was packed. Folding chairs arranged in rows facing a large projection screen, tables along the sides loaded with potluck dishes, bunting and decorations that made the whole thing feel like a cross between a political rally and a church social. Eleanor. Karen Henderson rushed over to greet me, her excitement palpable. I'm so glad you came. This is so exciting. I was immediately surrounded by neighbors, all of them buzzing with anticipation about the ceremony and the remarkable coincidence of my sharing a name with the guest of honor. Have you learned anything more about your family connection? Asked Betty from the craft group. Did you see the article in the Gazette? Added Mrs. Henderson. Tom did such a nice job with the story. I'd seen the article. The headline read, Local Woman Shares Name, Background with Presidential Medal Winner. The story made it sound like I was some sort of distant echo of the real Eleanor Patterson, a small-town shadow of a woman who'd actually accomplished something significant. Tom seemed very thorough, I said. Mayor Williams approached our group, extending his hand with the kind of practiced politician's smile that probably worked well at campaign events. Mrs. Patterson. So wonderful to meet you. What an honor to have someone with your connection to tonight's ceremony right here in Cedar Falls. My connection to myself. Thank you, Mayor Williams. I understand you work for the State Department as well? What are the odds? It's certainly remarkable. We're so proud to have this connection to tonight's honoree. It really puts Cedar Falls on the map, doesn't it? As if the map had been missing Cedar Falls until tonight, when they discovered they had a woman who shared a name with someone important. At 6:45, Karen called for everyone's attention. The room fell silent as she stood in front of the projection screen, clearly relishing her role as master of ceremonies. Friends, neighbors, fellow Iowans, she began, her voice carrying the gravity of someone introducing a historic moment. Tonight we gather to witness something truly special. One of our own, well, someone who shares a name with one of our own, will receive the highest honor our country can bestow on a civilian. Applause filled the room. I clapped along, the surreal nature of applauding for myself while everyone assumed I was applauding for someone else not lost on me. But before we begin, Karen continued, I want to recognize someone very special who's here with us tonight. Eleanor Patterson, our Eleanor Patterson, please stand up. The entire room turned to look at me. More applause, warmer this time, the kind of applause you give to someone you feel sorry for but want to make feel included. I stood briefly, waving with what I hope was appropriate modesty, then sat back down. Now, I know we're all curious about the family connection, Karen went on. And while our Eleanor is too modest to make any claims, I think we can all see the resemblance. The age, the name, the Iowa connection, even the State Department background, it's too much to be coincidental. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. They convinced themselves so thoroughly of this family connection theory that it had become accepted fact. So let's watch together as Eleanor Patterson, diplomat, peacemaker, and quite possibly our Eleanor's relative, receives the recognition she so richly deserves. The lights dimmed and the ceremony began. I watched myself on the screen, sitting in the front row of the White House East Room among the other recipients. The camera panned across us occasionally, and each time my face appeared, a little gasp would go up from the crowd. Look at the resemblance, someone whispered. She could be your sister, Mrs. Henderson said to me. Remarkable bone structure in that family, added Janet Morrison. The president began his remarks, explaining the significance of the Presidential Medal of Freedom and introducing each recipient. There were athletes and artists, scientists and civil rights leaders, people who'd made their mark in very public ways. And then there was me. Dr. Eleanor Patterson, the president's voice filled the room, devoted 45 years of her life to the service of peace and diplomacy. Working often behind the scenes, Dr. Patterson negotiated critical agreements that prevented conflicts, established educational programs that have transformed countless lives, and provided counsel to four administrations during some of our nation's most challenging moments. The camera focused on me as I sat listening, my expression serious and attentive. The Baltic Peace Accords of 1987, which prevented what could have been a devastating regional war, exist today because of Dr. Patterson's tireless mediation and her unprecedented understanding of the complex historical grievances involved. Around me in the community center, people were leaning forward, completely absorbed in the president's words. Her establishment of the International Women's Education Initiative has provided educational opportunities to over 2 million women and girls in developing countries, creating ripple effects of positive change that will last for generations. 2 million women, someone whispered. Can you imagine? Dr. Patterson's approach to diplomacy was revolutionary for its time and remains a model today. She believed that true peace could only be achieved through understanding, that lasting agreements could only be built on foundations of mutual respect and shared humanity. The president paused, looking directly at the camera. Perhaps most remarkably, Dr. Patterson accomplished all of this while deliberately staying out of the public eye. She believed that the work was more important than the recognition, that progress mattered more than credit. In an age of self-promotion and personal branding, Dr. Patterson chose a different path, the path of quiet service and profound impact. I could feel the room around me growing more emotional. Several people were wiping their eyes. It is therefore my great honor to present the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Dr. Eleanor Patterson, diplomat, educator, peacemaker, and patriot. On screen, I rose from my seat and walked toward the president. The camera followed my progress, and I could hear people in the room commenting on my bearing, my dignity, the way I carried myself. She moves like you do, Eleanor, Mrs. Henderson whispered to me. That same quiet confidence. The president placed the medal around my neck, shook my hand, and said something that the microphones didn't pick up but that made me smile on screen. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment when the ceremony would include brief remarks from each recipient. Dr. Patterson, the president said, would you like to share a few words? On screen, I stepped to the podium, looked out at the audience in the East Room, and began to speak. Thank you, Mr. President. This honor belongs not to me alone, but to all the people who believe that quiet work in service of others could change the world. In the community center, the silence was absolute. Everyone was hanging on every word. I've spent my career in rooms where history was made, but I want to speak tonight about a different kind of room. About kitchen tables where families decide their futures. About community centers where neighbors come together to support each other. About all the small places where ordinary people do extraordinary things every day. I could see people glancing at each other, recognizing their own lives in my words. True service isn't about recognition or acclaim. It's about showing up consistently, caring deeply, and believing that every person's dignity matters. It's about choosing to see the humanity in others, especially when they can't see their own worth. Karen Henderson was crying now, tears streaming down her face. I've been privileged to work on international agreements that made headlines. But I've learned that the most important work often happens in anonymity. The teacher who stays late to help a struggling student. The neighbor who brings food to someone who's lonely. The volunteer who shows up week after week, not for glory, but because the work needs to be done. The camera showed the audience in the East Room, but I was speaking to the audience in Cedar Falls. We live in a world that often overlooks quiet contributions, that mistakes visibility for value, that assumes that if something isn't celebrated publicly, it doesn't matter. But I'm here to tell you that every act of kindness matters. Every moment of genuine human connection makes a difference. Every person who chooses compassion over judgment is changing the world. I paused, looking directly into the camera. I want to close with a message for anyone who has ever felt invisible, overlooked, or undervalued. Your worth isn't determined by other people's recognition. Your contributions don't become less significant because they're not celebrated in headlines. And your story matters, even if, especially if, it's being written in the margins of history. The applause in the East Room was thunderous. In the community center, people were on their feet, clapping and crying and looking around at each other with new eyes. But I wasn't done. As the applause died down, I stepped back to the microphone for one final comment. I'd like to dedicate this honor to a small town in Iowa where I've learned some of life's most important lessons. To neighbors who care about each other. To people who show up for their community. To everyone who believes that kindness is never wasted and that every person deserves dignity and respect. And then I said the words that would change everything. Cedar Falls, Iowa, this medal belongs to all of you too. The silence in the community center was deafening. I watched as realization dawned on face after face. Mrs. Henderson's mouth fell open. Karen Henderson sank into her chair. Janet Morrison stared at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. Mayor Williams was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. Cedar Falls? Did she just say Cedar Falls? On screen, I was walking back to my seat, the ceremony moving on to the next recipient. But nobody in the community center was watching anymore. They were all looking at me. Eleanor, Karen said slowly, her voice shaking. Eleanor, why did she mention Cedar Falls? I stood up, feeling every eye in the room on me. Because I live there, I said simply. But you're you, Mrs. Henderson stammered. And she's. I'm both, I said. I'm the Eleanor Patterson you know, and I'm the Eleanor Patterson who just received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Same person. Same story. Just different chapters. The room erupted. Questions flew from every direction. People were standing, sitting, talking over each other, staring at me like I'd just materialized from another dimension. You're her? You're actually her? But you live on Maple Street. You make crafts? You needed help reaching the olive tapenade. I held up my hand for quiet, and gradually, the room settled. I am Dr. Eleanor Patterson. I did work for the State Department for 45 years. I did negotiate the Baltic Peace Accords. I did establish the International Women's Education Initiative. And I also live in a small house on Maple Street, shop at your grocery store, and apparently need help reaching things on high shelves. Karen Henderson looked like she was having trouble processing this information. But you let us think. We thought you were just what, Karen? She struggled for words. Just ordinary. And what made you think that being ordinary and being accomplished were mutually exclusive? The question hung in the air. Around the room, people were grappling with the implications of what they'd just learned. You let us feel sorry for you, Betty said, her tone almost accusatory. Did I? Or did you assume that because I was 70 and lived alone and didn't talk about my past, I must be pitiable? Janet Morrison found her voice. But why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say who you were? I looked around the room at these people who'd spent 5 years trying to fix my lonely, empty life. Because I wanted to be judged for who I am now, not for what I accomplished decades ago. Because I wanted to see if anyone would value Eleanor Patterson the neighbor before they knew about Eleanor Patterson the diplomat. But we did value you, Mrs. Henderson protested. You pitied me, Dolores. There's a difference. We cared about you. You cared about the sad old lady you thought I was. You wanted to fix my loneliness, brighten my empty days, give meaning to my small life. None of you ever considered that I might have chosen this life, that I might be content with my own company, that I might have stories and experiences and accomplishments that fulfilled me. The silence was profound. Around the room, I could see people thinking back over 5 years of interactions, reconsidering every assumption they'd made. We were trying to help, Karen said quietly. I know you were. And your intentions were kind. But Karen, you spent 5 years assuming I was desperate for friends without ever asking if I was happy with my social life. You assumed I was struggling financially without ever asking about my situation. You assumed my life was empty without ever asking what filled it. Mayor Williams cleared his throat. Dr. Patterson, I think we all owe you an apology. No, I said firmly. You don't owe me an apology. You owe yourselves some reflection. I walked to the front of the room, standing where Karen had stood just an hour earlier. Do you want to know what I learned from living among you for 5 years? I learned that people see what they expect to see. I learned that our society has very narrow definitions of what constitutes a valuable life. I learned that age and gender can make you invisible in ways that have nothing to do with your actual worth or capabilities. I looked around the room, making eye contact with people I'd known for years but who were seeing me clearly for the first time. I also learned that kindness matters, even when it's based on wrong assumptions. That community matters, even when it's imperfect. That people genuinely want to help each other, even when they don't understand what help is actually needed. Mrs. Henderson raised her hand tentatively, like a student in a classroom. Eleanor. Dr. Patterson. Can I ask you something? Of course. Were you ever actually lonely? All those times we worried about you. I considered the question carefully. Sometimes, I said honestly. But not in the way you thought. I was lonely for being seen as myself rather than as a problem to be solved. I was lonely for conversations about ideas rather than just my perceived needs. I was lonely for being valued for my mind rather than pitied for my circumstances. What about your family? Betty asked. We always felt sorry for you for not having children. I chose not to have children, Betty. I chose to devote my life to work that I felt passionate about. That choice came with trade-offs, but it wasn't a sacrifice. It was a decision about how I wanted to spend my one life. But don't you regret it? Don't you wish you had someone to take care of you? I smiled. I take care of myself quite well, thank you. And I have friends, real friends, people who know me fully, all over the world. Just because you can't see my support system doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Tom Bradley, the young reporter, had been furiously taking notes throughout this exchange. Now he looked up, his expression sheepish. Dr. Patterson, I feel terrible about that interview. About asking if you regretted not being more ambitious. Tom, you asked those questions because they reflected the assumptions of everyone in this room. You saw a retired government employee and a presidential medal winner and couldn't imagine they were the same person. But how did you? I mean, why did you let me write that story? Because I wanted to see what story you'd tell. I wanted to.